The nation that bombed London for 57 nights was rebuilt for free. The nation that stood alone against Hitler paid for 60 years. That's not an error. That's documented in U.S. Treasury files and British Parliament records. Germany received grants. Britain received a loan with interest compounding until 2006. History class says America saved its closest ally. The balance sheets say America foreclosed on its closest ally. Gold seized. Companies sold at half price. An empire dismantled through loan conditions, not military force. This isn't about blame. This is about mechanism, how $3.75 billion purchased global dominance without firing a single shot. December 1940. Britain is broke, and America is watching. December 29, 2006. A gray Friday morning in Westminster. Inside the British Treasury, a clerk named Margaret Ashworth sits at her desk processing the day's international payments. She is 58 years old, 3 years from retirement, and she has done this work for 3 decades. Verify the amount. Confirm the recipient. Authorize the transfer. Routine. But this payment is different. The check is written to the United States Treasury. The amount $832 million. And attached to the file is a reference number that traces back 60 years to a loan agreement signed before Margaret was born. She processes the payment. She closes the file. She marks it complete and moves to the next task. Margaret has no idea what she just did. She doesn't know that this is the final installment on a debt that has haunted Britain since 1946. She doesn't know that her country has now paid $7.5 billion total, double the original loan. She doesn't know that the file she just closed represents something far larger than a bank transfer. Somewhere in that filing cabinet is the receipt for an empire. Picture the scene, 66 years earlier. December 8, 1940. London is burning. German bombs have fallen on the city for 67 consecutive nights. Winston Churchill sits in the cabinet war room's underground, drafting the most important letter of his life. It is addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. The language is diplomatic, but the message underneath is simple. Britain is broke. The world's largest empire, a quarter of the Earth's surface, 450 million people. The pound sterling as global reserve currency cannot pay its bills. And without American supplies, Britain will starve within months. Here is what most people get wrong about World War II. They remember the military history, D-Day, the Battle of Britain, Allied victory. They don't remember the financial history. They don't know that before a single American soldier landed in Europe before Lend-Lease was even signed, Britain had already transferred more wealth to America than most nations possess. The extraction began in September 1939, the moment war was declared. Edward Colville was 43 years old in the summer of 1940, a senior official at the Bank of England. He still remembers the weight of the assignment. Operation Fish, the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. His job load, $2 billion in gold bars onto British battleships, sail them across 3,000 miles of U-boat-infested Atlantic and deliver them to the Federal Reserve in New York. Imagine the scene below decks. Crates stacked floor to ceiling, each one containing gold bars. The wealth of centuries packed into wooden boxes, sailing away from Britain forever. Colville watched the loading from the Portsmouth dockyard, knowing that every bar represented something Britain would never recover. "We weren't paying for weapons," he wrote later. "We were paying for the right to keep fighting." The gold was just the beginning. Eleanor Whitfield was 52 years old, a widow living in Surrey. Her husband had left her shares in American Telephone and Telegraph blue-chip stock, safe as houses, her retirement security. In October 1940, she received a government order surrender all American securities or face criminal prosecution. She remembers standing at the post office, holding the stock certificates her husband had kept in a locked drawer for 30 years. She handed them to the clerk. The government paid her a fraction of market value. Her shares were sold on the New York Stock Exchange. The money bought ammunition. Eleanor spent the rest of her life in a smaller house on a smaller pension, never understanding why winning a war had made her poor. By December 1940, Britain had liquidated $4 billion in gold and securities. But the invoices kept coming. American suppliers wanted payment. Britain had ordered $3 billion in tanks, planes, steel, and food and had no way to pay. This is when Roosevelt proposed Lend-Lease. He explained it with a folksy analogy that still appears in history textbooks. If your neighbor's house catches fire and you have a garden hose, you don't charge him $15. You lend him the hose and he returns it when the fire is out. It sounded generous. It sounded like neighbors helping neighbors. Why then did British negotiators describe the Lend-Lease talks as the most humiliating experience of their careers? Why did one diplomat cable London saying, "They are treating us not as allies, but as a bankrupt company in receivership"? Why did Britain emerge from those negotiations having sold its most profitable American company at half price, surrendered military bases for 99 years, and signed a clause that would dismantle the economic foundation of its empire? The answer reveals how financial power actually works. And it starts with a man named Henry Morgenthau Jr. Morgenthau was 50 years old in 1940, Secretary of the Treasury, Roosevelt's neighbor and closest friend in the cabinet. He genuinely wanted to help Britain defeat Hitler. But Morgenthau understood something that Churchill's letter made clear: Britain was desperate. And desperation creates leverage. Before America would give Britain a single dollar, Morgenthau demanded a complete audit of the British Empire. Every asset owned by the government. Every asset owned by British citizens. Every gold bar, every factory, every share of stock. He wanted Britain's books open to American inspection, not as a partner reviewing an ally, but as a creditor examining a debtor. The British negotiators were stunned. They had come expecting to discuss terms between friends. They found themselves stripped and searched like suspects at a border crossing. James Cromwell was 36, a junior Treasury official on the American negotiating team. Years later, he would describe the atmosphere in those rooms. The British thought they were asking for help. We knew they were asking for survival. Those are different negotiations. Survival has a price, and America was about to name it. What happened next would transfer the wealth of the world's largest empire to its replacement, not through armies, but through contracts. Not through conquest, but through compound interest. And the mechanism created in those negotiations would be used on over 80 countries in the decades that followed. But first, Britain had to be shown what desperation really costs. To understand what Morgenthau was about to do, you first need to understand what Britain was and what made it vulnerable. Picture a map of the world in September 1939. Shade in everything the British Empire controls. You would color a quarter of the Earth's surface. 450 million people lived under the Union Jack. The City of London was the center of global finance. The pound sterling was the currency other nations held in reserve. British overseas investments, railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, rubber plantations in Malaya, factories across America, generated $500 million annually. Not from labor, just from owning things. But here is what the map doesn't show: Britain's fatal weakness. Britain was an island. It imported 60% of its food. Every tank required foreign steel. Every plane required foreign aluminum. Every ship required foreign oil. The most powerful empire in history could not feed itself for 6 months without imports. Germany understood this. Hitler's strategy was never to invade Britain, it was to starve Britain. U-boats would sink merchant ships. The Luftwaffe would bomb ports, cut the supply lines, and the empire would collapse from hunger. This is why the Battle of the Atlantic, not the Battle of Britain, was the war's true decisive front. But that story is rarely told because it leads to uncomfortable questions about who saved whom and at what price. When war began, Britain needed massive imports from the only supplier capable of providing them, the United States. Tanks, planes, ammunition, food, everything had to cross 3,000 miles of ocean. But America in 1939 was neutral. The American public was isolationist, and Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts, which contained a provision called cash and carry. The rule was simple. Britain could buy American supplies, but only if it paid cash immediately and transported goods on its own ships. No credit, no loans, no exceptions. Why would America demand cash from an ally fighting fascism? The answer goes back 20 years. Thomas Lamont was 69 in 1940, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, the most powerful bank in America. He remembered the previous war, how Morgan had lent billions to Britain and France, how those loans had pulled America into the conflict, how Congress had blamed bankers for American boys dying in European trenches. The Neutrality Acts were written specifically to prevent another Morgan loan. Cash and carry wasn't about neutrality. It was about making sure Wall Street couldn't drag America into war again. At least that was the official explanation. Here is what most people get wrong about Lend-Lease. They think it was America helping Britain. The sequence was actually reversed. Before Lend-Lease existed, before Congress voted on anything, Britain had already paid billions in cash. And when the cash ran out, Britain began selling everything it owned. Remember Edward Colville loading gold onto battleships in Operation Fish. That $2 billion in gold went directly to the Federal Reserve. Remember Eleanor Whitfield surrendering her AT&T shares at the post office. Those shares were sold on the New York Stock Exchange. The money paid American suppliers before America had agreed to help at all. From September 1939 to March 1941, Britain transferred $4 billion in gold and $1 billion in securities to the United States. But the orders kept coming. By December 1940, Britain had ordered $3 billion in supplies it could not pay for. This is the moment when leverage appears. Think about this in terms you might understand from your own life. Imagine you're in a car accident, not your fault. You need emergency surgery or you'll die. You have insurance, but the hospital says your policy doesn't cover this procedure. There's one surgeon who can save you, and he's willing to operate, but first he wants to see your bank statements. Your investments. The deed to your house. He's not checking to see if you can pay. He's checking how much he can charge. That was Britain's position in December 1940. The surgery was American supplies. The price was everything Britain owned. And the surgeon Morgenthau was already reviewing the patient's assets. The most painful example was American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest rayon manufacturer in the United States, owned by Courtaulds, a British textile company. It employed thousands of American workers. It generated $5 million annually in dividends flowing back to Britain. On the open market in peacetime, the company was worth at least $100 million. Morgenthau pointed at it and said, "Sell it." Sir Edward Peacock was 69 years old, a director of the Bank of England sent to New York to manage the sale. He was a financial aristocrat educated at the finest schools, accustomed to negotiating from strength. In New York, he discovered what it felt like to negotiate from weakness. The American investment bankers, J.P. Morgan and Dillon Read, knew exactly how trapped Britain was. They offered $54 million. Peacock tried to negotiate. The bankers didn't move. $54 million, take it or leave it. Britain took it. A $100 million company sold for roughly half its value. The money went directly to pay for weapons Britain had already ordered. Imagine the scene in London when the cable arrived. A room full of Treasury officials realizing they had just lost one of Britain's most valuable American assets, and that this was only the beginning. But the American viscose sale was just the visible extraction. The deeper mechanism was being written into the structure of Lend-Lease itself. Roosevelt announced the program with his garden hose metaphor: lending, not selling, helping neighbors expecting nothing in return, except the hose back when the fire was out. What he didn't mention was Article 7. Article 7 was buried in the Lend-Lease agreement, written in diplomatic language designed to obscure its meaning. It stated that in return for American aid, Britain agreed to work toward the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce after the war. That phrase, discriminatory treatment, targeted one specific system, imperial preference. Why does a tariff system matter in the middle of a war? Because imperial preference was the economic glue holding the British Empire together. Here's how it worked. Goods flowing within the empire faced lower tariffs than goods from outside. Australian wool entering Britain paid less duty than American wool. Canadian wheat cost less than Argentine wheat. This meant British manufacturers had captive markets across a quarter of the globe protected from American competition. American corporations had been trying to crack those markets for decades. Article 7 was their key. By signing Lend-Lease, Britain agreed to dismantle imperial preference after the war to open empire markets to American goods on equal terms. It was economic suicide, written in diplomatic ink. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, saw exactly what was happening. He called Article 7 an instrument of American imperialism. He warned that signing it would make Britain an economic vassal after the war. Churchill overruled him. The mathematics of starvation left no room for negotiation. Here is the contrarian point that challenges the simple narrative Morgenthau wasn't evil. He genuinely wanted Hitler defeated. The American negotiators weren't villains, they were protecting American taxpayer interests. But the dynamic was unchanged. Britain needed survival. America had the only hose. The terms reflected that imbalance, not malice. By March 1941, Britain had been systematically stripped. Gold liquidated. American viscose sold at half price. Caribbean bases leased for 99 years in exchange for 50 obsolete destroyers. Article 7 signed away post-war markets. Only then did Congress pass Lend-Lease. The aid began flowing. $31 billion over 4 years. It kept Britain alive. Without it, Britain would have starved by 1942. But here is the open loop most histories ignore. Lend-Lease had an expiration date. The moment the war ended, the aid would stop, and Britain, its economy restructured entirely for war. Its factories producing only weapons, its people fed by American food, would face a choice: find new financing or collapse. Everything I've shown you so far was the entrance fee, what Britain paid just to qualify for help. The real extraction hadn't started yet. What happened in August 1945 would make the American viscose sale look like a rounding error. And it would kill the one man who saw it coming. What happened in August 1945 would make the American viscose sale look like a rounding error, and it would kill the one man who saw it coming. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radio, announcing surrender. In London, crowds flooded Trafalgar Square. Strangers embraced. Churchill appeared on a balcony, waving to thousands of weeping, cheering citizens. After 6 years of bombing, rationing, and death, Britain had won. The Nazi regime was destroyed. The empire had survived. 7 days later, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9697. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately. Completely. Without warning. American cargo ships in the middle of the Atlantic, carrying food, fuel, and industrial supplies to Britain, received radio orders to turn around. The aid that had kept 47 million people alive for 4 years stopped mid-ocean. No transition period. No grace window. Complete cutoff. William Strang was 52 years old, a senior official at the Foreign Office when the telegram arrived. He would later describe the moment as watching life support being unplugged from a patient still on the operating table. Britain's entire economy had been rebuilt around American supplies. Factories produced weapons, not consumer goods. Farms had been converted to airfields. Half the nation's food came through Lend-Lease. And now, 7 days after victory, the lifeline was severed. Here is what most people get wrong about the end of World War II. They imagine victory as liberation soldiers, coming home, celebrations in the streets, nations rebuilding together. For Britain, victory was the beginning of a new crisis. The war against Germany was over. The financial war for survival was just starting. Within weeks, bread rationing was introduced, something that hadn't been necessary during 6 years of German bombing. The nation that defeated Hitler couldn't feed its own people without American permission. Britain had one option: send someone to Washington, beg for a loan. The man chosen was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was 62 years old, the most famous economist alive. He had redesigned the global financial system after World War I. He had written the theoretical framework governments still use today. He had warned against Article 7. He had predicted exactly what would happen when Lend-Lease ended, and he was dying. His heart had been failing for years. Doctors told him another transatlantic voyage, another high-stress negotiation could kill him. Keynes sailed anyway. He believed in something that would prove fatal justice. His plan was elegant. Britain had stood alone against Hitler for 2 years, while America sold weapons for cash. Britain had bankrupted itself, saving Western civilization. Surely America would recognize this. Surely the terms would reflect gratitude. Keynes proposed $6 billion not as a loan, but as a grant. Retroactive compensation for Britain's sacrifice. Picture Keynes arriving in Washington, September 1945. Thin and exhausted, his suit hanging loose on a frame weakened by heart disease. He carried the moral weight of Britain's suffering. He expected it to matter. It didn't. The American negotiating team was led by Fred Vinson, Truman's Treasury Secretary. Vinson was 55, a Kentucky judge who had built his career in tax law. He approached Britain the way he approached any debtor. How much can we extract while they're desperate? Vinson's opening position: America would offer a loan, not a grant. Amount $3.75 billion, barely enough to prevent immediate collapse. Interest rate 2% compounding annually. Repayment period 50 years. And one non-negotiable condition that would prove more destructive than every German bomb combined: sterling convertibility. This is where the story turns. Pay close attention, because this mechanism is still being used today. During the war, Britain had created something called the sterling area. Countries across the empire, India, Egypt, Australia, and dozens of others held their reserves in British pounds. They couldn't convert those pounds to dollars. This trapped them in the British economic system, forced to buy British goods because they had no alternative. The sterling area was what remained of imperial preference after Article 7, a captive market keeping British industry alive. The Americans demanded that within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain must make the pound fully convertible to dollars. The moment that happened, every country holding pounds would rush to exchange them, because everyone wanted American goods, American markets, American opportunity. The pound would collapse. The sterling area would disintegrate. Britain's last economic advantage would evaporate. Keynes knew this was a death sentence. He had spent his career studying currency crises. He understood exactly what would happen. A run on the pound, the loan evaporating in weeks. Britain's remaining leverage destroyed forever. He fought against it for 3 months. Lord Halifax, the British ambassador, cabled London after one particularly brutal session. His message was 4 words: they mean to have it. Not the loan, the empire, the last remnants of British economic independence. Here is a question that reveals everything about power. Why would America deliberately impose a condition designed to destroy its closest ally's economy? The answer is simple. American corporations wanted access to sterling area markets. General Motors wanted to sell cars in Australia. Standard Oil wanted contracts in India. United States Steel wanted orders from South Africa. As long as those countries were trapped holding pounds, American business was locked out. Convertibility would blow the door open. Robert Brand was 67, a British banker on Keynes's negotiating team. He kept a diary of the Washington talks. One entry reads, "They speak of friendship while drawing up terms for our dismemberment." Pause this video for 10 seconds. Consider what you just heard. Britain's greatest economist. The man who literally wrote the book on how economies work fought for 3 months against a loan condition he knew would destroy his country. He had the data. He had the expertise. He predicted exactly what would happen. He was ignored because Britain had no leverage. That's not economics. That's what happens when you're desperate and the only lender knows it. Now continue watching, because what happened next proved Keynes right about everything. In December 1945, the British cabinet met to decide: accept the loan terms or refuse and face immediate collapse. Hugh Dalton, Chancellor of the Exchequer, presented the mathematics: without American dollars, Britain would run out of food within weeks. There was no alternative. Parliament voted to accept. Members described it as financial Munich, economic Versailles, selling the future to survive the present. They were right, but the alternative was starvation. Keynes returned to England broken. He died April 21, 1946, 3 months after the vote. His heart finally gave out. The man who had tried to build a fairer international system watched his own country stripped by the system's architects. His last public statement on the loan was bitter. "We shall be enslaved for the privilege of having saved civilization." Remember that sentence. It explains everything that followed. On July 15, 1947, per the loan terms, Britain made the pound fully convertible. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. Imagine a dam breaking. Every country holding sterling rushed to convert. India dumped pounds for dollars. Egypt converted. Australia converted. Argentina, Sweden, Belgium, Iraq. The entire sterling area fled to the dollar in a matter of days. Picture the Bank of England trading floor officials watching reserve figures update hour by hour. $700 million, nearly 20% of the entire loan, vanished in 5 weeks. Money borrowed to rebuild Britain was evaporating into currency speculation. On August 20, 1947, 35 days after convertibility began, Britain suspended it. The experiment was over. Britain had proven to the world that the pound was finished as a reserve currency. The dollar had won without firing a shot. And now comes the part that should make you angry. Pull up 2 photographs from 1948. On the left, a street in Stuttgart, Germany. Construction cranes on the skyline. New factories rising from rubble. Workers rebuilding with American money. Children playing in parks that had been bomb craters 3 years earlier. On the right, a street in Manchester, England. Grey, exhausted, unchanged. The same damaged buildings from the war still unrepaired. Women queuing for bread rations. Bread rationing that wasn't necessary during the war, but became necessary during peace. Germany in 1948 received Marshall Plan grants. Free money. No repayment required. $13 billion to rebuild the nation that started the war that murdered 6 million Jews, that bombed London for 57 consecutive nights. Britain in 1948 was still paying off the 1946 loan. Still rationing bread. Still watching its reserves drain. Hans Weber was 32 in 1948, a factory worker in Stuttgart. His plant had been destroyed by Allied bombing. By 1948, it was rebuilt with Marshall Plan funds. Hans earned good wages. By 1955, he owned a Volkswagen. By 1965, he owned a house. His children went to university. His grandchildren inherited wealth. Arthur Griffiths was 32 in 1948, a factory worker in Sheffield. His plant survived the war intact. But orders declined when imperial preference ended. By 1955, the plant was struggling. By 1965, it closed. Arthur's children didn't attend university. His grandchildren inherited nothing. The enemy rebuilt for free. The ally paid for 60 years. Write that down. Remember it the next time someone mentions the special relationship. But the loan payments were only the visible cost. The invisible cost, the markets lost, the industries strangled, the strategic leverage surrendered, would compound for decades. Britain had been broken not by German bombs, but by American contracts. And the mechanism that broke Britain was already being prepared for global deployment. Britain had been broken not by German bombs, but by American contracts. And the mechanism that broke Britain was already being prepared for global deployment. Empires don't collapse in a day. They bleed out over decades. The wound is inflicted in a moment of crisis, but death comes slowly, so slowly, that each generation believes things have always been this way. Picture a timeline stretching from 1947 to 2006. On one side track Britain's trajectory. On the other track, America's. In 1945, these were two victorious allies, two industrial powers, two nations that defeated fascism together. Watch what happens over 60 years. February 1947. While the pound was still collapsing from the convertibility disaster, the British government sent a telegram to Washington. For a century, Britain had guaranteed the independence of Greece and Turkey against Russian expansion. British ships controlled the eastern Mediterranean. British troops maintained the balance of power across 3 continents. The telegram said, "We're leaving. We cannot afford it anymore. If you want to stop the Soviets, it's your job now." This moment, unmarked in most history books, was the formal transfer of global leadership from London to Washington. The Truman Doctrine was announced weeks later. America would contain communism. America would police the world. The job Britain had held for 200 years passed to a new owner paid for with Britain's bankruptcy. Harold Macmillan was 53 in 1947, a Conservative MP who would later become Prime Minister. He understood what the telegram meant. Years later, he described Britain's new position with brutal clarity. "We are the Greeks in this American empire. They will run the world. We will provide the culture and the advisors." The Greeks, not the partners, not the equals. The Greeks, a conquered civilization, absorbed into someone else's empire. But the visible humiliation was just the beginning. The hidden cost would take decades to measure. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30% from $4.03 to $2.80. Overnight, every British citizen became 30% poorer relative to the world. Savings eroded. Imports became more expensive. The cost of living jumped while wages stayed flat. Remember Eleanor Whitfield, the widow who surrendered her AT&T shares at the post office in 1940? She died in 1971, having never recovered the wealth her husband left her. Those shares she surrendered American telephone and telegraph stock split multiple times over the following decades. If she had kept them, they would have been worth over $2 million by the time of her death. The forced sale didn't just cost her the 1940 value, it cost her 30 years of growth. Her granddaughter Patricia was 28 in 1971. She inherited nothing. She worked as a secretary in London, renting a flat she would never own. Patricia's daughter Emma is 34 today. She works 2 jobs and cannot afford to buy a home in the city where her family has lived for 5 generations. 3 generations of women. Same family. Exposed to the same economy. The trajectory was set in 1940 when a government order stripped their wealth to pay for American weapons. Now cross the Atlantic. Robert Harrington was 25 in 1946, a junior analyst at J.P. Morgan in New York. His job was processing the paperwork for British asset sales, including the American Viscose transaction. For every deal, Morgan collected fees. Robert received bonuses. By 1956, he was a vice president. By 1966, he was a managing director. By 1976, he retired to Connecticut with a portfolio worth $8 million, built on commissions from selling British assets at discount prices. His grandson Michael is 42 today. He inherited a trust fund. He works in private equity, buying distressed assets from countries facing debt crises. The family business continues. Same era, same financial system. Different sides of the transaction. The Whitfields lost everything. The Harringtons built a dynasty. Here is the question no one asks who designed it this way. The answer takes us to a hotel in New Hampshire, July 1944. While Britain still fought Germany while D-Day was barely a month old, American and British negotiators gathered at Bretton Woods to design the post-war financial system. The American delegation arrived with a plan already written. The dollar would become the world's reserve currency, backed by gold. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would be headquartered in Washington, controlled by American votes. And the IMF would have authority to impose conditions on any nation seeking financial assistance. Keynes was there. He fought this system. He proposed an international currency called Bancor that wouldn't favor any nation. He argued that a system dominated by one country's currency would make that country's problems everyone's problems. The Americans rejected it. Keynes had no leverage. Britain was already bankrupt. The American plan was adopted. What happened to Britain between 1946 and 1947? The conditional loan, the forced convertibility, the asset stripping wasn't an accident. It was the prototype. The first field test of a mechanism designed to be repeated. And repeated it was. Picture a map of the world. Highlight every country that has undergone an IMF structural adjustment program since 1946. The shading covers most of Latin America, most of Africa, significant portions of Asia and Eastern Europe. Over 80 nations in 75 years. The pattern is identical to Britain, 1946. Country faces crisis. IMF offers loan with conditions. Conditions require privatization of state assets, currency, convertibility, removal of trade protections. Foreign corporations, often American, buy privatized assets at discount prices. Local industries can't compete with imports. Country becomes permanently indebted. Mexico, 1982. The government couldn't pay its debts. IMF imposed structural adjustment. State industries were privatized. American banks bought Mexican assets. Mexican wages collapsed. The country has never fully recovered. Argentina, 2001. Currency crisis triggered by policies the IMF itself recommended. Structural adjustment imposed. State assets sold. American hedge funds bought Argentine debt at pennies on the dollar, then sued for full repayment. The litigation lasted 15 years. Thailand, 1997. Currency collapse. IMF conditions required opening financial markets to foreign ownership. American investment banks bought Thai companies at fire sale prices. Sound familiar? Greece, 2010. Sovereign debt crisis. Austerity imposed. Public assets privatized. German and French banks protected while Greek pensions were cut. A nation that had been independent for 2 centuries discovered it could no longer set its own economic policy. If the same mechanism produces the same results in 80 different countries over 75 years, is it a bug or a feature? Here is the contrarian point. The system isn't controlled by any single villain. There is no conspiracy. The IMF follows its mandate. Corporations pursue profits. Politicians respond to voters. Each actor behaves rationally within the rules. The extraction happens because the rules were designed to enable it at Bretton Woods in 1944, when Britain had no leverage to object. Remember Sir Edward Peacock, who sold American viscose at half price. He lived until 1962, long enough to watch British industry decline, long enough to understand what those fire sales had cost. In his final years, he told a financial historian, "We thought we were buying time. We were selling the future." That sentence could be carved on the tombstone of every nation that has accepted an IMF loan. And this brings us to the present. Because the system designed in 1944, tested on Britain in 1946, and deployed across 80 countries since then, is still operating today. The faces change. The flags change. The mechanism doesn't. The question isn't whether this system exists. The question is, whose 60 years are being counted right now? The question isn't whether this system exists. The question is, whose 60 years are being counted right now? Let me take you back one final time to December 29, 2006. Margaret Ashworth sat at her desk in the British Treasury processing the day's international payments. She verified the amount $832 million. She confirmed the recipient, United States Treasury. She authorized the transfer, closed the file, and went home to her family in Croydon. A routine Friday. Nothing remarkable. Margaret had no idea what she had just done. She didn't know that file represented 60 years of payments for a war that ended before she was born. She didn't know her grandmother had lived through the bread rationing of 1947 rationing, caused not by German bombs, but by American loan conditions. She didn't know that families like Eleanor Whitfield's had surrendered their savings to fund weapons that Britain was then charged interest to receive. She didn't know that the check she processed was the final installment on a transaction that transferred $450 billion in today's money from Britain to America. The file is closed now. Britain's visible debt is paid. But here is what the file doesn't show. It doesn't show the industries that collapsed when imperial preference ended the textile mills in Lancashire, the shipyards in Glasgow, the steel plants in Sheffield. It doesn't show the Caribbean bases still under American control 70 years after 50 obsolete destroyers were traded for 99-year leases. It doesn't show the sterling area countries that fled to the dollar in 35 days, never to return. It doesn't show the 3 generations of British families whose trajectories were bent downward by decisions made in Washington conference rooms. And it doesn't show the 80 other countries that went through the same mechanism after Britain. Margaret retired in 2009. She lives on a pension that buys less each year as inflation erodes its value. Her granddaughter Sophie is 28 years old in 2025. Sophie works at an American investment bank in London, Goldman Sachs, headquartered in New York, operating from a glass tower in the city. The same financial district that was once the center of global finance now hosts branches of American institutions. Sophie processes transactions for sovereign debt restructuring. She helps manage loans to countries facing currency crises. The paperwork crosses her desk: conditional loans, privatization requirements, structural adjustment terms. She doesn't recognize the pattern. Why would she? It's not taught in business school. But the pattern is there. The same pattern that stripped her great-great-grandmother's AT&T shares. The same pattern that sold American viscose at half price. The same pattern that drained 20% of Britain's loan in 35 days. Picture a screen showing global debt levels today. $317 trillion. That number is so large it loses meaning. But break it down, $15 trillion flows annually from debtor nations to creditor nations in interest payments alone. That's the mechanism operating at planetary scale. Here is the contrarian point that challenges even this narrative. There is no shadowy cabal orchestrating these outcomes. Morgenthau wasn't evil. He was protecting American taxpayers. Fred Vinson wasn't a villain. He was negotiating in his country's interest. The IMF follows its mandate. Corporations pursue profits. Politicians respond to voters. Each actor behaves rationally within the rules. The system doesn't require malice. It only requires leverage applied consistently over time. The extraction happens through legal contracts signed voluntarily by desperate borrowers who have no alternative. That's what makes it so difficult to fight. You cannot vote out compound interest. You cannot prosecute loan conditions. You cannot indict a mechanism that operates entirely within the law. James Chen is 41 years old, an economist at the IMF in Washington. His job is designing structural adjustment programs for countries requesting assistance. He believes in his work. He believes these programs help nations stabilize and grow. He doesn't see himself as part of an extraction system. He sees himself as a problem solver. And from inside the mechanism, he's right. Each individual decision makes sense. Each condition has a rationale. The pattern only becomes visible when you zoom out across decades and continents. So what questions should this history raise for someone watching in 2025? When you hear about a country receiving IMF assistance, ask what conditions are attached. What assets must be privatized? Who is buying those assets, and at what price? When you hear about a currency crisis in an emerging market, Ask what policy changes preceded the crisis. Was currency liberalization recently imposed? Who recommended that policy, and who benefits from its failure? When you hear about debt relief initiatives, ask what was extracted before relief was granted. What structural changes were locked in? What leverage was established that won't appear in the headlines? These aren't questions with simple answers. They're frameworks for seeing what the official narrative obscures. Understanding this history won't tell you what to do with your money. That's not the point. The point is to see the pattern so that when the next crisis unfolds, the next bailout is negotiated, the next structural adjustment is imposed, you'll recognize the mechanism. You'll remember that Britain paid until 2006 for the privilege of having survived. And you'll ask who is being asked to pay this time. Remember Keynes sailing to Washington, while his heart was failing, expecting justice, discovering that justice isn't a currency creditors recognize. Remember Sir Edward Peacock selling American viscose at half price, realizing decades later that they thought they were buying time, but were selling the future. Remember Hans Weber rebuilding in Stuttgart with free American money while Arthur Griffiths watched his Sheffield plant close. The stories repeat because the mechanism repeats. Different flags, different decades, same extraction. Let me leave you with this. Britain didn't lose World War II. Britain won the war and lost the peace. The victory was real. The sacrifice was genuine. The cost was hidden in loan documents and asset transfers and conditions that took 60 years to fully pay. $3.75 billion didn't help America surpass the British Empire. It purchased the British Empire through contracts, not combat. The war ended in 1945. The payments ended in 2006. The mechanism never ended at all. Whose 60 years are being counted right now yet. Empires don't fall to armies. They fall to balance sheets. And the receipts are always buried in files that clerks close without reading.